April 27, 1948. In post-war America, a genius con artist is born, one destined not to follow the rules, but to rewrite them entirely. Frank William Abagnale Jr. would defy the odds, walking the thin line between genius and deception. Armed with an extraordinary mind and unshakable confidence, he would outwit the FBI, CIA, and Interpol in a relentless game of cat and mouse. By the age of 21, Frank had done the unthinkable. He posed as an airline pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and even a college professor. He forged millions of dollars in fake checks across 26 countries, leaving authorities baffled at every turn. But behind every daring con lies the story of a boy driven by fear, ambition, and a refusal to accept failure. But before Frank became a master of deception, he was just a boy shaped by loss, ambition, and a fear of failure. To understand how he fooled the world, we must first understand the world he came from.
Abagnale did actually escape the plane while on the runway.
Imagine being 14 years old and watching your entire world fall apart. For Frank Abagnale Jr., life in New Rochelle, New York, once seemed idyllic. His father, a successful businessman, was the embodiment of charm and confidence, a man who could light up any room with his presence. His mother, graceful and loving, kept their family grounded. Together, they seemed unshakable. But then one day, everything unraveled. Frank's mother filed for divorce, shattering the stability he'd known. He chose to stay with his father, clinging to the hope that they could rebuild their lives. But the cracks only deepened. His father's business collapsed, and the man Frank idolized was reduced to delivering mail just to survive. Frank watched as the man who once commanded respect now struggled to keep a roof over their heads. The sight terrified him. Poverty was no longer an abstract fear. It was a reality he vowed to escape at any cost. Despite their circumstances, Frank's father never lost his charm. He brought Frank to business dinners, upscale events, and saloons, teaching him an unspoken lesson. Appearances matter. Frank, ever observant, noticed the subtle power these men wielded. Their sharp suits, magnetic smiles, and effortless confidence left a lasting impression. Charm, Frank thought, is a currency as valuable as cash. By the age of 15, Frank had already begun testing this newfound insight. Standing 6 feet tall and weighing 170 pounds, he carried himself with the confidence of someone much older. He charmed his way into exclusive rooms, talked himself out of trouble, and even tried his hand at small cons. Though caught a few times, his quick wit and charm always seemed to win people over. Each encounter was a lesson, sharpening his skills for the larger schemes to come. But as his father sank deeper into poverty, so did Frank's restlessness. He couldn't accept a life of mediocrity. One warm June morning in 1964, with just $200 in his pocket and no plan, Frank boarded a train to New York City. As the train sped toward the city, his heart raced. The buildings blurred past the window as he stared out, unsure of what lay ahead, but certain he couldn't look back. Fueled by a fear of mediocrity and a burning desire to escape his father's fate, Frank boarded the train to New York. It wasn't just a journey, it was his first step toward becoming the man he believed he needed to be. Over the next few years, he would transform into a master manipulator, pulling off cons so daring that they would baffle the FBI and cement his place as one of the most infamous con artists of all time. New York City. For Frank Abagnale Jr., it wasn't just a city, it was a blank canvas, a place where he could rewrite his story. Years later, he would call it the best years of his life. But at just 16 years old, Frank arrived with no connections, no experience, and no prospects. What he did have, however, was creativity, audacity, and a deep-seated fear of ending up like his father. Do you remember how his mature appearance gave him an edge? Standing 6 feet tall with the confidence of someone far older, Frank decided to use it to his advantage. He altered his driver's license to claim he was 26 and began forging checks, small amounts at first, just enough to get by. A few dollars here, a few dollars there. He hit 2 or 3 banks a day, perfecting his technique like a craftsman honing his trade. And then he had a realization. Why stop? Instead of finding a real job, Frank decided to double down. Small-time cons weren't enough for Frank. He craved more, a role that commanded respect and opened doors effortlessly. One day, as he watched airline pilots stride through the city, he realized he had found the perfect persona. One day, as Frank wandered through the city, he noticed airline pilots striding confidently in their crisp uniforms. Their presence was magnetic. They seemed untouchable, admired, and unquestioned. And in that moment, inspiration struck. Why not become a pilot, he thought. It was a bold idea, genius, as he would later call it. On a whim, Frank posed as a student journalist writing for his school newspaper. He interviewed pilots, asking them about their jobs and the intricacies of aviation. Armed with this knowledge, he assembled a convincing uniform. Using decals from toy airplanes, he crafted a fake pilot ID. The result? Perfection. By the age of 19, Frank had flown to 16 countries, all for free. On flights, he mingled with real pilots, learning enough jargon to blend in. He studied their behavior, their conversations, their routines. His charm and composure carried him through every interaction. But even the best lies have their limits. During a trip to Miami, a police officer detained Frank, suspicious of his youthful appearance. Staying calm, Frank used his charm and connections, referencing pilot friends he had made. The officer believed him, and Frank walked away unscathed. The Miami incident revealed the risks of his schemes, but it also bolstered his confidence. If he could talk his way out of that, he could do anything. In Atlanta, fate handed him his next daring role. A Dr. Frank moved to Atlanta, where fate introduced him to his next con. Sitting in an empty bar, he struck up a conversation with a doctor. Frank claimed to be a burned-out pediatrician taking a break from the profession. The doctor, intrigued, invited Frank to observe at the hospital. To Frank, this was an opportunity too good to pass up. He created a fake medical license and quickly befriended the hospital's nurses and staff. Over the next few weeks, he buried himself in medical textbooks and spent hours in the library, learning just enough to sound knowledgeable. His charm and quick wit won over his colleagues, and he soon landed a role supervising medical interns on the night shift. Whenever a question came up that he couldn't answer, Frank used humor to deflect or redirect the conversation to someone else. But his confidence cracked one fateful night. A young boy with a broken leg was brought in, crying in pain. The boy looked up at Frank with pleading eyes, seeking relief. In that moment, the weight of Frank's deception hit him. His ruse wasn't just a game, it was a danger to real people. That night, Frank made the decision to leave the hospital for good. Walking away from the hospital was a moment of rare self-awareness for Frank. But even as he left, his fear of failure and poverty pushed him forward. Louisiana would offer him another opportunity to reinvent himself before. Frank's journey led him to Louisiana, where a chance meeting with a former flight attendant opened a new door. Over drinks, he charmed her with tales of his supposed piloting career. But Frank wasn't content with just one lie. This time, he added another layer to his fabricated resume, a law degree from Harvard University. Impressed by his poise and accomplishments, the woman introduced Frank to a prominent law firm. To secure a position as an assistant to the district attorney, he needed to pass the Louisiana bar exam. While most people spent years preparing for the challenge, Frank had only a few weeks. Undeterred, he buried himself in books and, astonishingly, passed the test. For a time, Frank lived comfortably in his new role, but his success attracted attention. A curious colleague, intrigued by Frank's charisma and mysterious background, began asking too many questions. With the FBI closing in and his options dwindling, Frank knew his time was running out. He needed one last con, a scheme bold enough to secure his future and disappear for good. By now, Frank was wanted on 4 continents, and the FBI was closing in. Knowing he couldn't run forever, he decided to stage one final con, his most audacious yet. Hiring 8 flight attendants, all listed as Pan Am employees, he orchestrated a fake flight operation. By submitting fraudulent expense claims, Frank pocketed enough money to retire and live a quiet life. Adopting a new identity as a retired screenwriter, Frank moved to France. But the authorities weren't far behind. In a joint operation with French law enforcement, the FBI finally captured him. At just 21 years old, Frank Abagnale Jr. was sentenced to 6 months in a French prison. But his story didn't end there. While being extradited to the US, Frank made a move that cemented his place in history. During the flight, he slipped into the galley and found a hatch window. With the plane taxiing down the runway, Frank opened the hatch, climbed out, and disappeared into the night. The escape left authorities stunned. For weeks, Frank evaded capture, living off his wits and fading luck. But his freedom was short-lived. He was eventually found at the Montreal airport and sent to a high-security detention center. Even there, his ingenuity knew no bounds. Frank's calm demeanor and polished manners led prison staff to believe he was an undercover inspector evaluating the facility. Recognizing an opportunity, Frank contacted an ex-girlfriend and enlisted her help. She posed as a journalist, securing a police inspector's business card. Using it as a template, she created fake credentials in the name of a supposed FBI agent and listed her phone number as the contact. Frank handed the card to the guards, claiming he had urgent intelligence to share with the FBI. When the guards called the number, his ex-girlfriend, posing as an FBI secretary, confirmed his story. Convinced of his credentials, the staff allowed Frank to leave under the pretense of delivering classified information. For weeks, Frank stayed one step ahead of the authorities, but deep down, he knew the chase couldn't last forever. When 2 officers called out his name in New York City, Frank knew his run was finally over. "Hey, Frank," one called out. Though Frank tried to deny his identity, this time there was no escape. Frank confessed to all his crimes and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But even behind bars, his story took an unexpected turn. Recognizing his unique skills, the FBI enlisted Frank to help them catch other forgers and con artists. His insights were invaluable, and his cooperation led to a reduced sentence. After just 5 years, Frank was released. Frank Abagnale Jr. turned his life around. In 1980, he published his memoir, Catch Me If You Can, which became an instant hit and inspired a blockbuster film. He dedicated his life to fraud prevention, helping companies protect themselves from deception. What began as a tale of lies and ambition became one of redemption and reinvention. Frank's story is a testament to the power of resilience and the possibility of change. If you enjoyed this tale of audacity, deception, and redemption, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.